Okay, Chris, this is your cue.
For what now? Oh, after party, right? Have we stopped recording? No, we're still recording. So we found that oftentimes we'll do a roundtable discussion like this. At the end of that roundtable discussion, he'll turn off the record button, and everybody comes back to life or has something they wanted to say but we're unsure about because of the self-consciousness. But yeah, if anybody has any kind of final commentary for if this was a Marvel movie that after the credits scene or any final statements you wanted to make, feel free to let loose.
I mean, I'll just say that this is my first time ever doing one of these, and this was, oh my gosh, so much fun. I was so nervous, but I sat down, I had the water bottle, I was like, okay, I'm ready. I printed out a bunch of stuff. I was like, I'm good. I'm so prepared. I mean, this was just, this just felt like this was awesome. It felt almost like a college class, like we were just, doing like a lit review. This is so fun.
I was really nervous the first time we did this, and again, we were in the depths of it was December, right? The first December of COVID. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah. That was the first one.
Something like that. It was cold. It was awful. We're in Buffalo. The winter is just a nuclear nightmare.
Yeah,
we'd been on lockdown for almost a full year, something like 9 or 10 months, and we were hungry. We're desperate. We're starving for some kind of contact, and so I was very nervous and urgent.
For poetry, for connection, for something deeper than just, oh, cool, more bad news every day.
Yeah, I think that's why they are fun to do, and it's needless to say, it doesn't reach a huge audience, but yeah, I think that it is kind of a nice connection for people who are into that but might not have people to talk to necessarily who are also into it. But I do have a question to throw out there. If you had any perspective on it, I'll share mine just from kind of the editing side of the table. But a question came in from a submitter, William. And he questioned how some publications handle what they consider previously published. So I can kind of say, well, how we do it. But have you had any issues submitting work that's maybe got published in the meantime, as when it was out for other submissions? Any conflicts that that you remember?
Being the people pleaser that I am, I always did letter of the law. They said we do not accept previously published works. All right, I'll be super literal about that. But I've been out of the game for long enough, so I have no idea what some of the digital platforms might be doing now that kind of stuff is proliferated.
Yeah.
I mean, I also pretty much stuck to the letter of the law. I mean, at least in submitting, because most places will tell you very specifically, yes, you can do previously published work, or no, you can't do previously published work. And then if they say yes, then you say yes, this poem was published here, and you give them a link, and that kind of helps skirt any issues.
Yeah. So sometimes there's like an in between of like I guess I could speak to the Wild Roof, what I kind of use as my guideline. So like, for example, if somebody posts something on their social media, I wouldn't consider that published, but some places might. So it kind of depends on the publication, or even a personal website. I wouldn't consider that published. Or the William mentioned like listservs, if like people going back and forth with like stuff they're working on. So I wouldn't consider that published. So yeah, it kind of depends on the publication itself and what they say. But yeah, so I've come across it a couple of times, because some of them say even like, social media, nothing accepted that's been posted on social media. So
yeah, I have come across where I sent out a poem to a couple of places and it got accepted by 2 places, like in a relatively short amount of time.
Yeah, that does happen.
And I also, being a people pleaser, I like panicked. I was like, oh my gosh, oh no. And I was it felt so bad, but I mean, the one that took it first, I just let the other one know, and luckily they were cool with it and liked it and published it anyway. So like, it was fine, but I absolutely had that moment of like, what have I done?
There are those odd times you don't get a response for, a month, nothing comes back, and then like in one day, two get accepted.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had one like that, and luckily, like both places said, like, okay, we're good with that. A lot of times, even our last issue, one of the poems was previously published, but it was in a publication that only had one issue so far, so it was like a new publication. So I contacted them, kind of made sure they were okay with it, put a link and obviously the note. So if the publication is willing to work with it, I guess that's kind of the number one thing. But yeah, it's kind of an interesting twist, because like even if it's just online, is that published? I guess you could interpret it yes, you could interpret it maybe. Like for example, if it's on a personal website, like I don't know, I don't really consider that so much published. It has to be accepted somewhere. But
I have a potential personal conflict coming up along those lines, which is a problem I hope to have and then resolve in the easiest way possible, which is I have a manuscript for a chapbook that I'm sending out into the world. And some of the poems have already been published and a lot of them haven't. And so while it's circulating in the chapbook world, which is a very expensive world to circulate anything, because the submission fees for the contest are really high if you're doing quite a few of them. But meanwhile, I'm also sending these poems from this manuscript individually out to literary journals. And so one of them was selected by a literary journal that I'm just drooling over. I can't believe that they're ready to take this poem. And now, because also like you guys, I'm a total like play by the books. I do not want to upset anyone. What will happen if the manuscript gets selected because the poem isn't coming out till spring? So it's possible.
Oh, yeah.
And have to withdraw this poem from this other lit journal that does not do previously published. Now, what I've learned in the chapbook world is they're like, oh yeah, like if it's been published or not published, it generally doesn't matter because we're looking at collections of poems, but the journals want to be the first ones to have it. So, we'll see if I have to cross that bridge or not, but I was like,
yeah.
strategize this a little bit more clearly.
Yeah.
But
That's a good question.
those
You're
are-
making
yeah.
me, oh, sorry.
No, those are good questions to navigate. But yeah, those are like, because when you have those kind of competing interests, sometimes, from my perspective, I'm maybe I would probably be more willing to work with, more willing to work with that than average, as far as like previously published things. If there is an odd one, and just to kind of cover the bases, making sure it's okay with everybody, I'm willing to do it. But yeah, sometimes you run into one that's pretty strict.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was one kind of an interesting one, because I've heard some other kind of conversations take place on, just getting a lot of submissions that are then withdrawn, and then kind of having to deal with it. But I thought that was a good question.
It is. You're making me wonder about mine, because I have a poem that got accepted, but it was like a really long published time. Like they said they weren't going to put it on their website for like another year.
Sure.
And I was like, well, if my manuscript's like almost done, like if I publish my manuscript like sooner than a year, have I violated now I'm wondering about that. Shoot. It's a good question, Kelly. I'm gonna look into that.
As long as, I say like make sure, like, because it really depends on the specific publisher. So if you're working with one for the manuscript or one for the poem, just like if they're cool with it, then it's good.
Yeah, and I did have a scenario that is the same scenario that happened when my book was being released. I thought for sure that it was being released at this time, then it was like a month later. And so I had to call this journal and be like, okay, so actually the poem is going to come out sooner in my book. And they're like, oh, we're so excited for you. Like, we just want to support you. And that is the answer that I would hope that our community would have. And sometimes they don't, and that's okay too.
Right. So yeah, I think that kind of seems natural to me, but I'm coming from a different world, I guess. What was that one on a kind of a different note? I think last time we asked, who's your literary crush? Was that a question that came up?
That wasn't my idea.
Literary crush. Are we talking about like a writer or like a person in fiction?
I think it could be either, but I think the original parameters were based on the idea that I'm hoping, now that I'm marching headlong into middle age, I'm evolving from my Sylvia Plath crush, self-destructive, yet deeply intelligent, thoughtful, decisive, to Flannery O'Connor, more mature, arch sense of humor, intelligent sense of being, the kind of person that I hope to kind of end up with long term, just kind of representing my kind of evolution of thought as we think about the authorial element in our writing, which I know the death of the author eschews, but yeah, I think that's the basic premise, right, Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, whatever comes to mind first, I would accept as an answer. So characters, I would say, if that comes to mind first, go for it. When we asked it the last time, I think we all went with kind of a writer figure. So mine was Marilyn Robinson, the novelist and essayist, and that was probably true 10 years ago, and it's true today. So I'm pretty consistent.
Good for you.
Yeah, I think I would have also said Sylvia Plath up until maybe 10 years ago. And then, although I still love her, she'll always be my first love for sure. I've been really loving Richard Seiken and Sam Sachs right now. And definitely if I saw them, I would be like starry-eyed and unable to talk for a while.
Was the Sam Sykes you said?
I don't think they're my Sam Sachs and Richard Seiken. They're maybe not my, I mean, they're both male queer poets, so it's definitely, they're like not going to marry me if we're being honest about it. But if we're just looking at a marriage of poetry or ideas, their craft is what I strive for. Perhaps not the content of it, but the craft is pretty spot on.
This is such a good question. I've been like trying to filter through because there are so many. I'd say probably one of my original crushes was John Keats. I mean, come on, that's some of the most romantic poetry that's like ever been written. I mean, you know, that's just beautiful. And the movie Bright Star, come on, it's all delicious. But I think I don't know that I could necessarily call him a crush because he's like 70 and married and definitely not going to marry me, but Billy Collins is awesome. I love his poetry. I mean, I just love it so, because it seems so casual and it seems so lighthearted, but then he gets into some really serious ideas. And I also watched his masterclass where you begin with something familiar and then you go into something. He had that fantastic quote where he was like, you need to, if you're going to talk about something abstract, then you have to ground it. So if you're going to talk about death and existentialism, do it while sitting on a bench and eating a ham sandwich. Like, you have to ground it. And I was like, I love that so much. So I love Billy Collins. And then also recently, he is once again not going to marry me because he's deceased, but Leonard Cohen, he wrote the Book of Longing. Has anyone read that? That's his. I mean, he's been more primarily a musician, but his book of poetry, I think it won a prize, is I mean, it's also all over the place. Some of them are short snippets, some of them are long, some of them fit into sort of like a poet, you know, structure, and some of them very much are sort of like short essays. But I have really been enjoying those lately. They're very just reflective, and yeah, I like those.
Nice.
Have any of you guys encountered Richard Saunders yet?
What was that, Chris?
Have you guys encountered Richard Saunders, I think his name is, or Sanders?
Richard Saunders. No, I haven't.
Short story writer, and he's totally up to date. Richard Saunders.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
very interesting. He kind of, Billy Collins reminds me of him, but in the short story form, where kind of playful, seemingly light, but then suddenly you're kind of engaged in these deeper ideas. And he described a condition that many of us male writers have, and his technical term for this condition was Hemingway boner, where we have a crush on Hemingway and we're going to try to write like Hemingway, and by God, we're going to strip it down.
Oh my God.
And so the fact that he was, and it was,
oh my gosh.
He teaches at Syracuse, and so the way he frames it is, I had to go through my Hemingway boner period, and a lot of male writers kind of go through that, and he was able to find his own voice after he kind of graduated from that period.
Hopefully avoid the
Look,
alcoholism, you know.
Is George Saunders, is that the one?
Yeah, that could be the guy.
Okay, I think that's the one you're
It should
talking
be,
about.
if it's,
Short
was it
stories.
Abraham Lincoln in the boudoir, something
I
like
think
that.
so, yeah. I think that's George Saunders. But yeah, that's
The fact that he was able to articulate that
That's the guy.
particular itch that so many of us have a crush on him
Yeah.
and I in particular, and then articulate it so well was nice.
yeah. Well, I have one final question, if you're up for it. Because this past week, I discovered a couple of boxes of books that somebody down the street was getting rid of. And I scooped them up and brought them in, went through them. There's kind of an interesting mix of stuff all in all, but there was a lot of sci-fi. So we're talking Frank Herbert, Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, some other stuff that's more obscure perhaps. So what's your take on sci-fi? Take it, leave it. Any of it good, some of it good, some of it bad?
Thumbs up for me. I finished reading Dune for the first time like 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, so it's
Amazing.
Frank Herbert, that's the Dune guy.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a bunch of Frank Herbert that's not Dune that I got, that I am now the owner of.
Awesome. But yeah, no, I like sci-fi.
All right, yeah, go ahead.
It's like film noir. It's a medium that you can be superficial and it can be great, but you can also kind of use that frame, a kind of a superficial traditional frame, to really dig into some heavy duty ideas. And, you know, I would call Vonnegut in many cases sci-fi, and, you know, he's also doing satire, but he's also doing a little philosophy and a little politics. So I think it's got a great deal of utility.
Yeah. I mean, if we're going back to the beginning, I mean, that was Mary Shelley, right? She wrote Frankenstein. That was technically the first sci-fi novel, but even though the majority of it was a philosophical question, that was still technically like, you know, sci-fi. And
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, and I wonder if our language around it is somewhat limited. I'm thinking about, we have so many words for magical realism or speculative writing, and I'm not so familiar if there's like subgenres within sci-fi that would be more, you know, is this like political sci-fi or gender rights sci-fi? You know, I'm thinking she's on my list. I haven't read any of Ursula Le Guin before, but she's up there for sure in my stack of books. But I'm hearing more and more Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities really talking about sci-fi as a place where they can create a world that should be in existence, but is not in existence. And so I think politically right now, and within like the realm of human rights, it can play a really important part in imagining what we want to see happen in the future.
Yeah. I mean, I think the same thing is with fantasy. Fantasy is, there's that great quote by Neil Gaiman that says, you know, sometimes fiction can be truer than truth. And so that's, you know, sometimes in a fictional world, and with fantasy or with sci-fi, that's where you can examine things, you can examine questions that would be a little bit more difficult to stomach in if you just wrote them very literally. But when you put them almost sort of like in a fantastical subtext, everyone's like, oh, okay. And it becomes much easier to examine them on a much larger scale.
Yeah, glad you reminded me of Neil Gaiman. I would also add him to my author crush column.
I love him. I say that would be another author crush, Neil Gaiman. Absolutely. He liked one of my tweets. I about died.
Can I touch
He tweeted something, and yes, he tweeted something and he liked it, which means there's an infinitesimal part of his brain that knows I exist.
Right, you're practically royalty right now.
Basically, we're basically best friends. He's my last call before bed.
Very good.
That's good. Yeah, I'm glad you had a couple of takes on it, because I get caught up. Well, for one thing, I read Isaac Asimov in like, I was probably still in high school, because it was just, you got like a reading list and you had to pick like 3 books on it. And that's like, my father had like some old sci-fi books, and like Isaac Asimov was part of it. So I read, you know, some of that. I did like it at the time. I wasn't really into the larger literature world at that point in my life, but I did like it at the time, and then got away from sci-fi and all the other stuff. So I kind of think of it as one thing, which is not obviously not super accurate, but I just kind of lump it all together. which you're right. I think there's obviously many subcategories and stuff like that. But I think I have a superficial hang up of like, if it takes place in space, like I'm out, like I am disengaged. I just can't get there. But I mean, and Isaac Asimov does take place in space, and that's probably why I never went back to it.
I was gonna
But
say Dune does as well, kind
right,
of. It's on different planets and stuff.
they all do. So it's just like my like dismissal of that genre. But I mean, right, it is.
For Ender's Game.
I have that book now. So we're working in metaphors. So yeah, like you said, you're creating your own world, a different world that has different assumptions and different presuppositions and all that good stuff, which I do like. But I just have this kind of mental block at some point where like I can't get there. So I mean, it's my deal, which is it's not to say that it's all bad stuff, but it's just kind
Kelly
of,
already mentioned Ursula Le Guin. I think she's a nice, clean
of course, yeah.
window between
Oh
those
yeah,
two
she's
worlds.
wonderful.
Some of those short
Yeah.
stories.
That reminds me, I was going to put that in.
Stories that just blew me away,
I was
and
going
they're
to put
all
that.
in space. They're all a galaxy far, far away, but
Yeah,
they're
yeah.
anthropological. They're very psychological. They're kind of get at some of these big societal moves one way or the other. And I would also do a plug for a short story called "The Story of Your Life" by Ted Chiang. Anybody? All right, let me shamelessly try to push Ted Chiang, Chiang. He wrote a short story that got turned into a movie called Arrival, which on the surface seems like a very similar aliens come to the planet Earth and we're not sure about their intention story, but it's so philosophical. It's about grief. It has a kind of a seasons changing element baked into it. And it also does some fun stuff with time and quantum. But it leans more towards the metaphysical and philosophical, and doesn't get too technical. But the main character is a linguist, so of course I love it because she's trying to decipher the alien language, and they lean on that. It's not special effects, it's not shooting and lasers. It's an individual person trying to understand a complete other that we have no idea if the other is a threat or not, and she's the linguist who has to decide if they're hostile or not. It's very nice.
Yeah, good. It's not a healthy perspective to have just like blockade all, everything that is perceived as like some kind of sci-fi, even though it takes place in a different galaxy. So I'm glad I got some ideas there, and it's a little bit of encouragement to like be a little more open to that. That's better. That's a better place to be, I think.
Don't forget, Thomas Pynchon wrote My Inherent Vice, which is just a straight hard-boiled novel, but written by Thomas Pynchon.
And yeah, I mean, there's any number of things you could say. It's like this, it's like that, and I say, yeah, of course.
It's the genre clearly outgrows itself.
But there are some bad ones. Like I've read the first page of a couple of these. Some of them are pretty bad. Some of these fantasy novels.
Yeah. One of a friend of mine actually sent me, well, I mean, you may have to edit this out because I'm not trying to get sued, but he said, yeah. A friend of mine sent me a book. I can't remember what the name of it was now. It was a young adult novel that was like the top Amazon seller. It was like the top 2 or 3 for like 6 months. And he was like, I know you're a writer. So he like sent me a copy. I couldn't even, I think I got 2/3 of the way through. I still haven't finished it. It was a mixture of Les Mis, the musical, and Kipling's The Jungle Book.
Wow.
Took 2 very good things and put them together into a very awful bad thing. And it was a female writer, and that was one of those things that I was reading, and I was trying to like give her credence and get through it, and I was like, this is just, every page is worse than the last. Which is a weird kind of positive encouragement, actually, because sometimes the thing you need in order to write well is to read bad writing and be like, okay, I could do at least a little bit better than this. I'm going to write some stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. So,
Oh,
yeah.
no, Kelly had to leave.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
shoot.
Kelly had to leave.
Oh, bummer.
But yeah,
Bye, Kelly. It's
thanks.
too late.
Bye, bye, Kelly.
Thanks to Kelly. But yeah, thanks for sticking around. It's nice to get just a couple extra questions in there, and we can
Yeah.
we use them. If not, it's just fun to get a couple of extra thoughts while we're at it. So yeah, thanks again. Good
Thank you so
selections.
much.
Thanks
This has
for your
been
input.
so fun. I loved being a part of it.